So we're going to break this down into 3 different types of transmission. We're going to do contact transmission, vehicle transmission, and vector transmission. So let's talk about contact transmission first. Contact, we know what contact is, right? Person to person. We can um, also further categorize contact transmission as direct contact, indirect contact, and then we're going to do the next slide and do one more type. So let's talk about direct and indirect first. Direct contact is easily defined, person to person, body contact, touching, kissing, if it's a sexually transmitted infection, sex, sexual intercourse. If it's a zoonotic infection, touching, biting, scratching from an animal, coming in contact. This is direct contact with an animal and passing this zoonotic transmission before, or direct contact with people. Another type of direct contact is between mom and baby in utero. So through the placenta. Remember we said the placenta protects the baby. Typically you don't find pathogens in the baby, in the placenta, and in the uterus. However, there are a few that have virulence factors that allow it to pass from mom to the baby via the placenta. This is also considered direct contact transmission. Now, there is a way you can have contact transmission, and it just involves one person. This is where it goes from a portal of exit to a portal of entry. So we talked about feces being a portal of exit. If that fecal contact goes immediately back into the mouth, you get portal of exit to portal of entry, and you can reinfect yourself. That is considered direct contact. I know it sounds gross. Think about children. Think about how often they're touching things and then putting things in their mouth. Pinworms is an example where it's very easy to reinfect yourself. Pinworms get into the gastrointestinal tract. They live, they reproduce. The female crawls into the anal tissues and then deposits eggs at the anus. And then as feces pass through, it picks up the eggs, and that can, be transmitted that way. But those eggs are in the anal regions. The worms, the pinworms crawling in that region cause itchiness. And children tend to scratch, and so they scratch their anal regions, and the little bitty eggs get picked up under their fingernails. And then they pick up something, hands go into their mouth, and then they reinfect themselves and add more eggs into their gastrointestinal tract to grow into adult worms. This is also considered a direct contact transmission. Okay, so some diseases have direct contact transmission, some don't. Some have different ways of being transmitted. Indirect contact. Many different diseases can be transmitted by indirect contact. There's a word that's actually come out in the news, these fomites. Fomites are inanimate objects that can carry pathogens. So some bacteria, some viruses can stay infectious on an inanimate object. This is why your toothbrush, if you get strep throat, your doctor says, after 24 to 48 hours on your antibiotics, you need to disinfect your toothbrush, or better yet, just get a new toothbrush, because the streptococcal bacteria can remain on your toothbrush and you can reinfect yourself after treating it with the medication. So that is an example of a fomites, something that carries an inanimate object that can carry bacteria or viruses. We've talked a lot about that with COVID-19. It looks like coronaviruses may live for a short period of time on some objects, plastic objects from that. And so that's why they're saying to wipe down things that have been around an infected person, to disinfect things that you come in contact with. Now, they do not think this is the primary source of infection from COVID-19. Mostly they think that is this next category, which is droplet transmission. Droplet transmission is still under contact transmission. This is where a cough or a sneeze, or even somebody just talking, that these droplets that are generated can contain the virus. And then if it comes in contact with someone else nearby, then that can be a source of contamination. And that's what they think, based on other coronaviruses and studies that they've done, that this particular one that causes COVID-19 is predominantly spread by droplet transmission. Doesn't mean it can't be spread indirectly with objects or with contact, but this is the predominant method of spread. That's why they're telling you, if you're sick, to wear a mask. It's to protect others from that droplets that are coming out. All right, the deal with droplet transmission and why it's considered contact transmission is you have to be in close proximity. 3 feet, 1 meter. You have to be close from this. This is different than airborne, which we're going to talk about in a minute. So droplet transmission, you have to be in close proximity. It is coughing, it is sneezing, but it's also just talking. So that's why they're telling people 6 feet away. They want you farther so that that droplet transmission isn't spread. There's another case that's come out in the media about a choir. And right at the beginning of this, they had a church choir practice. And they stayed away from each other, but they did come and do choir practice in the same room. And and now I think there were, somebody will fact check me, I think there were 60 people that came to the rehearsal, and now I think 45 of them have been diagnosed with this COVID-19. And so a lot of people are talking about airborne, but singing forcefully thrusts those droplets into the air may not necessarily be airborne, as people keep talking about, but that droplet transmission, just being in the same room, and especially in an activity like singing, where you're inhaling deep and then exhaling with force, that droplet transmission can very easily spread through the entire choir. I can see that that could happen and still be considered contact transmission. Okay, so droplet transmission is considered contact transmission, and this is easily confused with the next category that we're going to talk about, which is airborne transmission. And you can see airborne transmission is under a completely different heading. Contact transmission, direct contact, indirect contact, contact, and droplet. Droplet, even if you don't touch the person, those droplets is considered contact transmission. Must be within 1 meter. If a pathogen is airborne, this means it is aerosolized into the air, but then it can travel further than a meter. This is where it can get into air conditioning systems. This is where it can go across the room, further than 3 feet apart. And some things, especially like fungus and spores, can be miles. This is airborne. This is a lot more concerning than droplet transmission. And this is where people have a hard time distinguishing, lay people, especially media. It's kind of a pet peeve of mine. The difference between droplet transmission and airborne transmission. And the media keeps pushing, is this disease COVID-19? Is it airborne? Is it airborne? Now, this is a new disease, and they are still doing studies. And there has been a preliminary study saying that they have found it in the air for a significant period of time. We do not know if just because they found it in the air, if it was still infectious. This particular study was looking at nucleic acid. And we know that the nucleic acid that's in the center of the virion may not be still infectious. We might have lost some of those outer membranes, envelopes, capsids that have make it infectious, even if the nucleic acid is still present. So we're still working on this. They do not think that it is airborne, meaning that it can go further than a meter. They definitely think it's droplet transmission. All right, but again, we'll figure that out as time passes and as more studies are done. But the public has a hard time distinguishing between droplet transmission, which is contact, and airborne transmission. Now, if a pathogen is airborne, it makes it more dangerous. Tuberculosis, this is definitely airborne. Through the coughing, exhaling, these airborne droplets get aerosolized, and the tuberculosis bacteria can exist and travel. This is why tuberculosis patients, when they're entered in the hospital, they're kept in these negative pressure rooms where the tuberculosis bacteria can't leave that room into air systems and potentially contaminate the entire hospital. As a pathogen that is truly airborne is much more dangerous from a transmission point of view. All right, Legionnaire's disease, that's another one that's a respiratory disease that is airborne, and that is much more serious when that appears. All right, COVID-19, probably not, though we don't know for sure, but there is some preliminary studies that might be a little more airborne than they thought, but I don't know about that. We'll see. Time will tell. Okay, so vehicle transmission. Vehicle and transmission. It's being transmitted by a vehicle, and in this case, it is the air, further than 1 meter. What other vehicles are pathogens used to transport? Water. So talked about cholera. Cholera comes out feces. Feces get contaminated in the water, and then someone else drinks the contaminated water. A lot of gastrointestinal diseases have a waterborne transmission. It takes a vehicle, the water, to contaminate that. Fecal to oral contamination. Again, pathogens exiting through the feces ended up in the water sources. You've not been around anyone with cholera, but the water has been. And it's transmitted to a new person. So waterborne transmission, that can be another vehicle that can transmit diseases. What else? Foodborne transmission. Food is another vehicle. This happens a lot when we talk about pathogens, undercooked food. So you can get salmonella from undercooked chicken. So if pathogens are cooked completely, that will usually take care of any pathogens. Things that are not cooked completely and may harbor some pathogens from that. Worms, a lot of worms are in this foodborne transmission there. They get into the fish, and then we consume the fish, and then that's what happens there. There are a couple of interesting things with foodborne transmission. A lot of people think about food poisoning from this. You eat the food, then you get sick. There's a couple different types of food poisoning. You can have food toxication. Food intoxication is a type of food poisoning. And this is where we've got Staph aureus on our skin. So we know Staphylococcus aureus colonizes our skin. Doesn't cause us a problem as long as it stays there. But say you're preparing potato salad or something for the potluck, or you're going to a family event or something, and you didn't wash your hands properly, Staphylococcus aureus comes into contact with the food. You're mixing it up. You leave the food out. When you get there, it sits out on a table for 6 hours, 8 hours. We know how this family reunions type things go. Somebody else comes back for leftovers, and it's been sitting out. The bacteria that's in the food is using the food as a food source, and it is replicating. So those small amounts of Staph aureus that you inadvertently put into the food were able to sit there and replicate. And now you have large numbers of Staph aureus. Staph aureus can be making toxins during those time periods. You consume the food, and it's not that you're consuming the bacteria, you're consuming the toxins that the bacteria has been making during this time period. That will make you sick pretty quickly. Within an hour or two, you'll start feeling bad, and that's when you're like, oh, I ate something bad at the family reunion, and now I'm sick. That's a very quick food poisoning. That's usually what people are talking about when they talk about food poisoning. I ate something bad at lunchtime, and now I'm sick a couple of hours later. And you have symptoms such as vomiting and diarrhea. Now, there's a different type of food poisoning that's called food infection, or bacterial infections from food. That's where the food is harboring a bacteria. You eat the food with the bacteria, such as salmonella. The bacteria now has gotten into your body. It will stay. You're now infected with this bacteria. That bacteria will live and start to replicate into large numbers, and it becomes a pathogen in your body and will start making other symptoms from that. Usually that takes a little more time. Usually that's 24, 48 hours, or maybe 48 hours after you've consumed the food, and so you have to search back a little further for what you ate. And those are slightly different types of food-borne transmission. Okay, interesting information on there. The last type of vehicle is bodily fluid transmission, and we talked about bodily fluids with contact transmission. So especially sexually transmitted infections, you get contact with that semen or vaginal secretions or whatever, and you get contact transmission. But that bodily fluids by themselves, if they are infected, can be a sort of vehicle transmission. So if you get HIV not from sexual intercourse or sexual activity, but you get HIV due to an inadvertent needle stick from something, That would be where you came in contact with someone's bodily fluid. You didn't come in contact with them, you came in contact with their bodily fluid. That puts it into vehicle transmission, blood, urine, saliva. So again, healthcare workers need to be extremely careful when dealing with bodily fluids that they don't get infected that way. All right, so this is a case where, okay, so let's talk about COVID-19. We have a lot of medical professionals getting sick. If they are in close contact with the person due to intubation and normal care, that's going to be contact transmission. If a lab worker comes in contact with the fluids sent for sampling or for testing and they get sick, that's vehicle transmission. They didn't have any contact with the patient, they had a contact with the patient's bodily fluids. Okay, so there's a difference in that. All right, so that is transmission there. Let me see if I can go through that. So we've done contact transmission, we've done vehicle transmission. The last type of transmission is vector transmission. A vector is an animal that transmits the disease from one host to another. So these are your biting insects or your insects in general. We can further categorize vectors as biological vectors or mechanical vectors, and I'll tell you the difference from that. But if there's an intermediate, an animal, say a mosquito bites a person or an animal that has malaria and then bites a new host and transmits that blood into the new host, that would be vector transmission. All right, so biological vectors are your biting insects. These are insects that will bite and then serve as a host. Part of that bacteria or pathogen's life cycle will include being inside the biological vector. So that serves as a host. Doesn't get the disease, but it serves as a host. Mechanical vectors is where an insect will kind of walk across like a housefly, will walk across feces in the backyard and then land on your sandwich at your picnic. That is passively carrying it, picks it up on its legs and then carries it from there. Okay, so there's a difference between biological vectors and mechanical vectors. Basically, anything that bites is going to be biological. Mosquitoes, we've talked about that. Malaria, dengue fever, yellow fever, those are in that. Ticks bite. Ticks can carry Lyme disease. That's a big one that's come up because we've found an acute Lyme disease infection, but then we found that this particular bacteria will stay with you a long time and can cause chronic Lyme disease and lead to a whole host of other issues. So this is a big one that's come back up in the last decade or so. Fleas can spread the plague. They can spread some other things. This picture right here, I bet you don't know what this is. This is a louse. You may still not know what that is because louse is singular for the words, for the term lice, like mouse and mice. This is a louse. And if you have more than one, you have a lice. We are familiar with lice because basically you never find one. They're always there. This actually bites. It can transmit a disease. Now, lice typically in our area are not carrying this particular bacteria, but lice can transmit typhus from that. So that can be an issue. Not all lice can carry this bacteria. We still want to get rid of them because they bite and they itch and other certain things. What else? Anything that bites from that. Mechanical vectors. Here's your cockroach. This is your basic housefly. These are the ones that are walking across something bad, picking up something, and then transmitting it into something that you're eating. All right, so difference between biological vectors and mechanical vectors.